For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan.
果然是曹操。
A sound plan. Certainly. Justice will come. For honor. A sound plan. Feel my wrath. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For my father and king. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Our allies have under siege. Certainly. For honor. Betrayal of light. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Foul name. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For my father has changed. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Justice has come. Foul. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Betrayal of light.
你要走了，你怎么？
For honor.
你到自己死掉啊？
For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound.
他打到自己死掉了、啊。出事阿贝。
Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Justice come. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For my father and king. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Feel my wrath. For honor. Of course. Is there danger? The light is my strength. I stand for the light. The light is my strength. Justice shall be done. Is there danger? The light is my strength. Is there danger? The light is my strength. Is there danger? For honor. Certainly. Betrayal of the light. Of course. Justice has come. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course.
哇，他们怎么直接冲进去死？
Our allies' hero has fallen. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Betrayal of the light. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. You have passed. For honor. Of course. For honor. For honor. A
谢喽
sound plan. Certainly. Justice has come. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. I'm here to help. I wish only I stand for the light. Of course. Is there danger? For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Foul me. Feel my wrath. A sound plan. Of course. Justice has come. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
啊，他奶了一口，
A sound
不然砍到都应该就死了。
for honor. Certainly. For Lord around. Of course. A sound
Forces are under attack.
certainly. A sound
有弹吗？
A sound
Allied hero has fallen.
certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Feel my wrath. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
他打不走，
Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. For my father the king. Feel my wrath. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
Betrayer of the light. You are passing against us.
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course.
买啥呢？
Certainly. I'm here to help. For honor.
第二招蛮烂的吗？
A sound.
也不到烂啊，还勉强可以的。
A sound plan. Certainly.
只是前面不会点而已。
Of course. Feel my wrath. Certainly. Justice has come. A sound plan. I'm here to help.
想学，
For honor. Certainly. For honor. Feel my wrath. Certainly.
抓到了。
Of course. A sound plan.
我感觉这个马超很慌。
Betrayer of the light.
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. I'm here to help. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor.
应该过16点就会点的。
For honor.
What does the shadow will?
Of course. Certainly. A sound. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. You are passing.
这是 combo 好猛。
Of course. Certainly. For
Our
honor.
allies' town is under siege.
想学想不屌。
A sound plan. For honor. Is there danger? A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor.
靠腰，
Certainly. For Lord Oran. Of course.
啊，我饿了。
Feel my wrath. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
哎，他醒来了。
Of course.
我刚想去怎么按到啊？妈的，亏烂呢！抓到说。
A sound plan. Of course.
Hero has fallen.
Certainly. Is there danger? For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For my father, the king. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
You are past redemption.
For honor. A sound plan. For honor. For Lord Oran. Certainly. For Lord Oran.
Our hero
没有中，冲崩了。等一下补一把大地吧，大地就可以秒掉了。但我钱喷掉就是3个人哦。
Justice shall be done. Of course. A sound.
还在追，还在追。
Might. Of course.
allies' hero has fallen.
I'm here to help. A sound. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For my father. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Where should this love be still?
有喽，
Here to help. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
Betrayer of the light.
Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Foul.
Betrayer of the light.
Certainly.
他飞上去了。
Of course.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
I stand for the light. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
You are past redemption.
For my father. For honor. Certainly.
这个塔可以拔一下。
Of course. Certainly. I stand for the light. Of course. A sound. Of course. For honor.
现在没招。
Certainly. A sound plan. Foul name. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. The light is my strength. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. sound plan. Of course.
Our allies' hero has fallen. Our allies' town is under siege.
Certainly. Of course. For Lord,
Betrayer of the light.
certainly. Certainly.
学
A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan.
那个塔就算了吧，
For honor.
刚第谁没注意到？
Certainly. Is there danger? Of course. For honor. The light is my strength. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Here to help. A sound plan. For honor.
Allies' hero has
好，一家死。
For honor.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Is there danger? A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
我们崩塔也是一直灌的，
Allies' hero has fallen.
灌很
Of
凶。
course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course.
冲啊！
Certainly. A sound plan. For Lord of Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound
Our allies' town is
For
under
honor.
siege.
for my father. Feel my wrath. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
啊，
For honor.
Our allies' town is under siege.
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course.
第谁没报道，可惜。
Of course. I stand for the light. Certainly.
Our allies' town is under siege.
Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
我想想看，我等一下出什么。
A sound plan.
You are passing.
For honor.
You are passing. Our allies' hero has fallen.
A
Our
sound
allies'
plan.
town is under siege.
Certainly. I'm here to help. For honor. Justice shall be done. Of course. A
Our
sound plan.
allies' hero has fallen. Our allies' town is under siege.
The light is my strength. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Justice shall be done. The light is my strength. Of course. Certainly.
Our allies' town
Of
is
course.
under siege.
For honor. Certainly. Justice shall be done. For honor.
司马昭很肥的话，应该蛮好打的。
Certainly. For honor.
他现在赚钱基本上是没有烦恼了，
Of course.
有雷甲赚钱没烦恼。
A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
Our allies' town is under siege.
For Lord Orion. Stand for the light. Certainly.
一个一个砍下来。
For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly.
You are passionate.
For honor. A sound plan. Of course.
Feel my wrath. You
好
are
，GG 了。